without further ado, let's just introduce author and web psychologist Nathalie Nahai.
Good morning, everyone. Wie geht's? Okay. I only know a couple of words in German, including Wellen Sie dich? Any takers? Meerschweinchen. It's mostly, the animals. Anyway, today I'm going to be speaking with you for the next 35 minutes about the psychology behind great user experience. There's quite a lot of content, so I'm going to give this talk to you in PDF afterwards, so the geeks among us can dive into the research if you want to, and it means you can just enjoy it and not have to take loads of notes. So let's talk about technology. So from smartphones and coffee machines to medical equipment and touchscreens and cars, touchscreens have become ubiquitous, and they're apparent in all sorts of areas of our lives. And the thing is, we're designing these interfaces for humans. And if we know anything about humans, it's that humans are not simple. And when it comes to interfaces, we have to consider the fact that we're designing for complex organisms, you and me and our users, and that we've evolved to experience, process, and respond to complex environments. And we do this through a multitude of senses, taking in loads of input so that we can process what's relevant and what's not. The tricky thing is, of course, that when we're working with touchscreens, we're collapsing, essentially, a rich environment into two dimensions. So we're optimizing for a small band of senses, primarily the visual sense, but also when you're talking about haptics, you've got touch, and auditory senses if you're doing things like Siri and Alexa. So if we're going to succeed, given that we're minimizing the amount of input that we're able to consume through these various small bandwidth of senses, we have to understand, principally, the psychological context, the principles, and the biases that shape and influence people's behaviors. So the first thing to say here is that we actually face quite a big challenge. And the first challenge, as designers, is that of interaction cost. So this is a concept that was proposed and introduced in the early days of research into human-computer interaction. And essentially, it means the sum of efforts, both mental and physical, that we must deploy in order to interact with a system or an interface for the user to reach his or her goals. If we break it down more concisely, interaction can be seen as a direct measure of usability. So if you want usability to be good, interaction cost has to be low. And there's an interaction cost associated with most of the things that we do on interfaces every single day. So minimizing the amount of reading we have to do, the scrolling that we're insisted on doing, the need to search for relevant information when it's not presented at the right place at the right time, making sure that we can comprehend the information that's already demonstrated to us, making sure we can click and touch screens without mistakes, typing, page load and waiting times, and also attention switches between one task and the other. So we've got a lot to compete against. So how do we reduce the cost across all of these different domains? A good place to start is by looking at the principle of cognitive load. So this is essentially the load that performing a task imposes on your cognitive system. Or if you want to put it in a different way, it's the total amount of mental effort being used in your working memory to get something done. So if I ask you guys to pour me a nice German beer, very easy, you can do it in your sleep. That's low mental effort, low cognitive load. If I ask you guys to do my tax returns, I'm now living in Spain and I've got to do it for the UK as well, it's a pain in the arse, high mental effort, high cognitive load. You probably tell me to sod off because we like that which is easy. And the reason for this is that we have a limited conscious cognitive capacity. We have limited capacity for being consciously engaged in an action at any given time. And so if we want to encourage use and engagement, we have to lower the mental effort and reduce the friction to the task completion. This is especially important on mobile, and a couple of years ago, there was this really weird and interesting study that I came across by Ericsson Labs that looked at the different kinds of stress associated with various situations and the mental effort or cognitive load associated with these situations. And they found that the cognitive load associated with watching a horror movie was comparable to experiencing delays on your mobile phone when you're waiting for an app to load or something to download. So I know this makes it a silly example, but it shows that we have really little tolerance of shit going wrong on our screens, especially when they're small screens. But I want to give you some examples of some brands that are actually doing this quite well, they're getting it right. How many of you use Spotify? Large number of us, okay. So one of the things that I really like is that when they are optimizing for a small screen, they make it super easy in terms of navigation by stacking it in such a way that it's really intuitive. So of course, most people primarily go on for music, so it's pre-selected. You've got the sub-menu underneath, no need for breadcrumbs, because you know where you are at any given chance, because they know what their users actually want. And if they're going to encourage new behaviors, so with podcasts, I run a podcast, they make it easy for you to take the first step. They reduce the anxiety by making the suggestion. They ask the question, and you can go ahead and find what you're listening for. Another example, not in touchscreens, but they make a really good use case for reducing mental effort. The following is an email that I received from Uber a while ago, and I really like that they were explicit and playful in knowing that they wanted to reduce my mental effort. This is what they said. So I get an email. We know that you're scanning this email to save time. Sync calendar with Uber to save more. It's super playful, it does the job, and it points directly to the fact that I don't have time for this, so they're going to make it easy for me. Great example of lowering the mental effort. So they all share specific principles, and there's another one I want to show you now because it's a classic one, but it highlights very specific points that are going to be useful for you. If you can remember when there was joy and hope and optimism in the world, feels like a very long time ago. Sorry, I'm a Brit, we're contending with Brexit, I know what we're talking about. This was the original... This is the original donations landing page, and the guy that was leading the UX team, his name is Kyle Rush, was tasked with optimizing this page to increase donations. So remember, we're trying to lower the mental effort and the friction to make the experience fluent and easy to increase donations. So you look at this, your heart's going to sink, or at least my heart sinks when I see this. The top of the page, you've got loads of forms to fill in. Right at the beginning, they're leading with the pain of paying. This is a bad idea. Even Obama looks uncomfortable. He's like looking away from the call to action. So they ran loads of different tests, and they ended up with this. Now, how interactive are you feeling? Are you willing to interact with me, play a little bit? We'll see. Okay, so what's the first thing that you notice about the new version of the page? Stick your hand up and shout. Anyone? Yes. There's a price selection? Yes. What else? Bingo. Yes, the visual cue is there. His whole body is facing the call to action. You're literally on his side. And this is where language comes in. A lot of the metaphors that we use in language reflect a physical lived experience. So being on someone's side, there's a sense of intimacy. His eye gaze also is looking that way. What else? The money comes first. But, yes, but what's interesting with that is that there are pre-selected buttons, so you don't have to conjure up in your mind, shit, what am I going to pay? You just hit a button. Also, the other thing that it does with the buttons is it gives you the possibility to commit at the very beginning. This then initiates a consistency principle. If I've explicitly committed to a price, then later when I go through the steps, I'm more likely to put in the effort because I've already sunk the cost of time and effort to get to that stage. Does that make sense? Okay, so when we make an explicit commitment, we want to remain internally consistent with it, and we're more likely to complete the action. What else do you notice? What? No bureaucracy. Ah, there you are. Yes, you're quite right. There's not lots of information that you have to type in, so the interaction cost at this stage is quite low. Anything else? Yes? You're good with the visuals. Yes, there's a lot more people in the background. This is an example of social proof. So if lots of people are doing something, usually a tipping point is around 10% of a population, then other people will start to follow because we tend to think that that which our community is doing is probably good for us to do too. Okay, so there's lots of things. You're already geared into looking for these specific principles. Lots of things that they did that made a huge impact on increasing donations. First, instead of having a white, long, bureaucratic page, they chunked it into two. The top part is visually much more interesting. We can understand visual imagery much more rapidly than we understand text. You have the body pointing towards the call to action. His jacket is off. It feels more intimate. Social proof of the people in the background. You have a step-by-step guide where you are in the process. Different countries differ in their tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty. And especially when it comes to parting with money, in this case with many people who had never donated before, is going to reduce the stress and the anxiety by showing them where they are in the checkout. Also, in many Western cultures, green has a positive association with a reinforcement. You then have the pre-selected amounts. Because it was a grassroots campaign, they led with a small number. This is interesting. This is to do with price anchoring. If you're interested in pricing psychology and you're trying to sell an expensive product, you would normally lead with a higher number, so the average spending rate goes up. Some of you already know about this. In this case, they were trying to do the opposite to encourage more people to buy. There's still the possibility to enter whatever amount you want, so people still have their own agency. And the stuff that's all the legal bump that you don't want to read, that's stressful to encounter, is made less visually salient by being bumped to the bottom of the page. There's actually more in the second version than in the first one, but it feels less heavy because it's not as visually important on the page. So how do you use this stuff? Well, the first thing to say is that you need to have an intuitive user experience, so the flow of actions, the process, has to make sense to the user. You have to limit text, scroll, and search. Reduce the actions required to achieve the goal. This is super important. You may think that 5 actions are necessary. Users might tell you something different. And if you are going to have a lot of different steps, make sure you split complex processes into single steps and then minimize the visual clutter by chunking design elements together, like we saw in that example. Okay, so you can also reduce cognitive load by focusing on something known as processing fluency. And this is essentially the ease with which we process any kind of information, whether it's visual stuff like photography or faces, or text, or auditory, or haptic cues. And the thing to know here is that content, which is easier to process, will of course be generally easier to manage. It will also be perceived as more trustworthy than stuff which is less fluent. So if you're a brand and you're trying to reach out to new customers that don't know who you are, trust is going to be really important. So if you can make your content fluent, it genders that source of sense of trust. So how do we do this? Well, there are various tactics that you can use. The first thing is to focus on perceptual fluency by making things visually as clear as possible. We all know this example. Nice blank page, bright logo, single call to action. When you're designing interfaces, often there's a lot more complexity involved. A good example of a brand that does this well, Slack. They make the user interface easy to understand. There's a high contrast between the navigation bar and the information. And even the navigation is chunked into areas that makes it easier to split. When you look at technology out and about in the world, great example here, coffee machines. I love a coffee. A lot of these machines are so badly designed, and they should be simple. One machine that does do this well is Breville. And you'll see that they have both the image and the text that makes it really rapid for you to understand the information, the content. You can choose what you want, it's consistent, and they're finding a way to capture quite a lot of information in quite a simple, easy-to-read screen. That's an example. Another thing you have to do to increase the ease of processing of your information is to focus on consistency. And this is really important when it comes to interfaces. So if you can make sure that your user interface is consistent and predictable, it makes the navigation easier to learn and to use. Again, that's going to reduce the stress. You also have to understand, manage, and set the right user expectations so that it avoids task interruptions. If they know what to expect, they don't suddenly have to go, oh, well, hang on, I need to research this on YouTube because I don't know what happens next or how to get to where I'm going. You also have to be careful, of course, with the design by using predictability and a sense of rhythm to reduce the mental effort at every step. Nice example here. I use this platform quite a lot. I like their website for this specific reason. They're consistent in the symmetry of their site design. This sounds so simple, and it is simple. But if you have an asymmetrical balance of design on a page and you're scrolling down, it creates a subconscious sense of ease. It makes the content more digestible, makes it easier for people to flow. Another interface that I use a lot, PowerPoint, to design these slides in particular. When they bring out new features, I hate getting new features because then I have to learn everything all again and it gets in the way, and I'd only just learnt the last one, and how dare you? And so it's really frustrating getting all these heavy language instructions. I'm like, just sod off, let me do my thing. But what they've done really well is that they've used, because it's primarily, for me at least, a visual platform, they've used a video. If you look at the top left-hand corner, or your right, I should say, visual image to show what can be done. Imagine if you had to describe that. You can take the screen, you can resize it, Language-based information is not going to be that useful. By capturing everything, putting it into an image, it's going to be much easier to understand. You can also increase the processing fluency by looking to other senses to help the flow of information and how we're interpreting what we're interacting with. This is where responsiveness and haptic cues come in. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, because we're complex systems and we've evolved to be in complex environments, we're actually habituated to being responded to. If I'm speaking to you and you're all sitting there with your arms crossed and your eyes shut, I'm going to probably go off and have a cry in the corner. The thing is, I'm waiting for your response to know how to gauge it. The same thing is true when we're designing interfaces. We also have to figure out which interactions to acknowledge and confirm, because we desire feedback, immediate feedback, on whether what we're doing is appropriate or not. Which means that if you can read your actions with appropriate feedback, so it might be a haptic cue of 1 buzz for yes and 2 buzzes for no, something as simple as that, you're going to quickly habituate the user to understand what's acceptable, what's not, and they'll learn the platform more quickly. We can also do this to reinforce positive or useful behaviors, which is a whole other talk, but you can condition the user to understand what the principles are or what the actions are possible on your user interface by using this. And it doesn't have to be just haptic. You can also use highlights, animations, etc. A nice example of this, again, using Dropbox when you're logged in. There's usually quite a lot of written content. I usually ignore this. But what they do is highlight areas where they really want me to pay attention. So it's having a priority of information. And then when they're encouraging me to interact with the presentation itself, highlighting it, giving me a sense of actually where I am, and giving me immediate feedback. So that's really important to do. OK. You can also look at linguistic fluency by making things phonologically simple. I realize the irony of saying something is phonologically simple. Anyway, like language. OK, so Slack does this well, where work happens, very direct, big, black, bold font on a light background, high contrast, very clear language. Another platform, Mike, trying to get people to take action on their site. Limited palette of colors. It's not noisy. You've got 3 colors, well, white, gray, and mint, and they're telling you exactly what you're going to get, and they're linking it in to your physical experience of the world today. So get the story to fuel your conversation. Single call to action. Again, another example here, Simon Sinek, and you're starting to notice a pattern, or you should be, hopefully. And it's the same thing that you see when you look at a lot of the major brands, especially in the US. What do you notice about the language, about the font? You can shout out if you like, or I can give you the answer. Sans serif, yeah? Sans serif, it's all pretty bold, there's a high contrast with the background, and it's the Helvetica font family. Now what's really interesting, this may seem banal to you guys, well, I hope it doesn't, I find it really exciting, is that these sorts of fonts are found to boost processing fluency. Because they're easy to read, they induce a positive mood. If you create a positive emotional state, you're going to get a better sense of resonance with your customers. They make information easier to process and instructions simpler to follow. So if you're trying to get someone habituated to your platform and you've got fonts from this family, high contrast, you're going to be already ahead of the game. So how to use it, some simple things that you can do. Increase the contrast between the text and the background, especially if you have auto-playing videos. People don't check this. It's such an obvious thing to say, but make sure that if you've got videos, you can read the text at every point. Easy to read sans serif font. Simplify your language online and in person. It is tempting if you're in the medical space or the auto space to use jargon. But actually, we process concrete, tangible words much more quickly than we process jargon, even within specific industries. So make sure that you have a direct and tangible call to action as well. OK, once you've captured people's attention, how do you get them engaged? How do you get them coming back for more? Well, this is where a curious principle known as hedonic adaptation kicks in. This is the idea that we become very accustomed to a positive or a negative stimulus over time, so the emotional effect of that stimulus attenuates. So if there's a bad sound in the next door neighbor's house, and it's going and going like, I live in Barcelona, it's really loud, and it suddenly stops, your response to that resets. So when it starts up again, it makes you even more stressed. And it's the same thing with positive stuff. If you split a massage into two where you have a break in the middle, you're resetting our response so that when it starts again, it feels better than if you just carried on. So we have this desensitizing response to our environment. And this happens over time, and it happens across all sorts of things. So for features and concepts and rewards, and even apps, games, products, interfaces, etc. Now, how many of you remember playing this? Raise your hands if you... yeah, Murmur of Happiness. I remember playing this when it came out, and I was on the tube in London when I was still living in London, and you could hear that little squawks and things. And it was very exciting because it was new, it was fun, usage was high, the novelty was high, and everyone was talking about it, so again, that social proof. And then what happens? Over time, a couple of months go by, you start to get familiar with it, it starts to get a little bit more boring, right? So they're thinking, well, hang on, how do we get people involved? You're hedonically adapting to the stimulus. You're desensitizing to it. It doesn't give you that same sense of excitement as before. They bring out a new one. So it's familiar, you know it's going to be fun, but it's also new, so then the usage spikes again. And then we adapt. And so what happens? They bring out a new one. And you start to notice a very specific pattern. When something is novel and it's exciting, usage is high, as long as it's an intuitive enough platform to where you're getting a sense of excitement and joy met. And over time, of course, the usage goes down because the novelty wears off. So if you are creating experiences for people, you have to figure out where the sweet spot is, where people have that sense of trust, they've got that familiarity, that foundation to say, okay, I know roughly what to expect, but at the same time, they're also being treated to novelty and to excitement and arousal. And it's quite a tricky thing to get right. So how do we use this principle? How do we do it? One of the things is to update your product frequently. Now, when I say frequently, I don't mean so frequently that you piss everybody off and they stop you. And this is a real problem, and they stop using it. A great example of this, it wasn't even frequency, it was scale of the issue. How many of you used to use eBay when it was still yellow back in the super early days? Someone, yeah, me too. Okay, there's some of us. Okay, so eBay, before it was widely adopted, and my parents were still scared about making transactions online with their credit cards, eBay had a yellow background, quite bright and yellow. And the early adopters loved it. It was super exciting. This was our platform. There was a community. And overnight, some wise guru over at eBay decided that it wasn't going to attract a wider public if it was yellow. Let's switch it to white. So they switched it to white. And the next day, all the users came on. They were like, what have you done to our platform? This used to be yellow. It was bright. It was our home. You've ruined it, it's white. And they got so many complaints that they had to revert it back. But what's interesting is that they didn't just revert it back. They decided that really they did want it to be white. And so over time, they slowly made it less and less yellow until it was white. But by then, we kind of adapted along with them. It's like boiling the frog. That's such a horrible example. But you get to the point where you just have gone along with it. And so when you're thinking about, this is to highlight the point that we don't like massive changes. And so if you're going to make big changes, sometimes it helps to make these changes in a smaller way, in an iterative way, and also to judge what frequency of change is going to be appropriate for your audience. Okay, so you can also make it more interesting for people by changing the layout and the structure. Again, don't break the user experience by making it so different that people don't understand what's happening. So you alter the user experience in smaller ways. Make the rewards unpredictable. And this is where we get into really fun territory. So the principles that I've just talked about work pretty much across almost all devices. But there is one principle in common that is super interesting that we work with every single day. And I'd like you to think about what the following platforms have in common. So we have Tinder or Grindr or any kind of, I know in Germany you've got some interesting dating apps, any kind of dating app, infinite scroll on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok, This is the bit where you're going to tell me, what is it that these platforms make you feel? Nothing. Huh? You're feeling something rewarded, did you say? Thank you, sorry. Yes, rewarded. And someone said something about addiction. That was an interesting comment. Yeah, addiction and excitement. What's next? Okay, so a sense of what's next, anticipation. I didn't understand what you said, I'm very sorry. Excess. Ah, okay, yes, so everyone else is there. So there's also that element of social dynamics that comes into play, which is complex and interesting. But what I want to suggest here is that we know when we're whipping out these devices and we're looking at these platforms that there is the promise of a reward, somehow. We know that there's going to be some sort of response. And this is because they all trigger our dopamine system. Now, dopamine is a neurochemical in the brain that was discovered back in the 50s by 2 Swedish researchers. And they found that it's involved in all sorts of things in the body and the mind, including mood, attention, sleep, etc. But critically for us, when we're designing any kind of system, virtual or physical, dopamine is a neurochemical that causes pleasure-seeking behavior. Some of us are more sensation-seeking than others, but many of the platforms that we interact with on a daily basis have this knowledge built in to how they're designed. So for example, let's take a physical situation. After conference drinks this evening, when we're all going to go have beers with KDAB, your dopamine system will kick in. You'll get a sense of wanting a bit of stimulation and excitement, especially after listening to people talk all day. And because you're in a beautiful city with really interesting people, you'll take action, you'll have a couple of drinks, and hopefully the complementary opioid system in the brain gets to kick in. You can actually enjoy the evening for a few hours together and feel satisfied. Now, this is quite a rare feeling that we give ourselves the time and the space to rest in a sense of satisfaction. And this is interesting because habitual products actually create dopamine loops. And this is something that we are probably all familiar with. And it's a sensation that dopamine starts us seeking, whether it's information or contact, and then we get rewarded for seeking by getting information that makes us laugh or changes our mood, and then it makes us seek more. So it's the same reason why, for instance, I'll be taking my phone out at 1 a.m. when I should be sleeping and resting for a conference like this, and then I suddenly see guinea pigs running into piles of popcorn. Like, I don't know to search for that, but it exists, and the reason that I find it is because I'm constantly refreshing a feed until I end up in a really weird place. So what happens for this to be a possibility in how we interact with our tech? Well, if you're feeling bored or lonely or frustrated or you want some stimulation, the dopamine system kicks in. You're wanting a sense of stimulation, so you take action. You whip out your phone, you take a look on the different social platforms that you're a member of, and because the rewards are tiny, how much satisfaction are you really going to get from a like, or from a retweet, or from a bit of footage that lasts for 30 seconds? Because it's not satisfying enough, the opioid system cannot kick in. You don't feel satisfied, and so you end up in this search that keeps going and going until something takes you out of it. So what's happening here? Well, we generally seek more than we are satisfied. This is a function of evolution. It's thought, when you think of it in evolutionary terms, that those members of our community that were able to seek out new sources of food and water, they'd have an evolutionary advantage. So now we're left with that. And you see when you look at the brain research that you get greater patterns of activity of reward in the brain when we're anticipating the reward, when we're fantasizing about it, than when we're actually receiving it. This is so sad. If you're fantasizing about that promotion or the speedy car or the hot date or the family holiday, often our fantasy of it is so much more rewarding than when we actually get the car or the holiday or the promotion, which is where mindfulness meditation comes in. It helps bring us back into that sense of satiety. But dopamine loops are also initiated by external triggers. We know that we're going to get some sort of cue, like a notification, a ping, a sound, a vibration, that tells us, that conditions us, that something fun is coming. So then the reward is small, and it's unpredictable. This is known as a variable ratio of reinforcement, variable in terms of timing, in terms of size, and reinforcing because we know that sometimes we get a reward. So we get that kind of pattern of behavior where we're constantly seeking it. You also find this to be the most effective way of getting rats and pigeons and other mammals, and also birds actually, to seek out reward in clinical trials. And you also see this pattern in gambling arenas. You know if you're going to get some money from a slot machine, it will happen at some point. You don't know when, you engage more. But you don't just find this particular form of dopamine loop dynamic happening on social platforms, as I've just described. I've recently also seen this on websites. So I recently moved flat, and I was looking for some stuff to put into my house, and I found this website, actually through Instagram. It was an advertising thing that came up. So I land on the page, and there's a spinning wheel, and this is very exciting, and it's giving me the choice whether I want to play. So I'm like, yes, I'm going to play. So I'm going to play, and then, oh, no, hang on, you have to give us your email address. Of course they want my email address. Nothing comes for free. So I thought, right, I've already started, all the while taking screenshots, because this is useful for talks like this. Give the email address, and then I spin. And would you guess I actually won something? Of course. So 15%, and then look at the click out. Reject discount code. And remember at the beginning when we were talking about Obama and the commitment, when you commit to something, you then want to remain internally consistent, and it's hard to then break away from that commitment to that action. This is a similar thing. I've already spun the wheel, I've given them my address. If I don't continue, it will feel like something's a bit off. So I think, right, I'll keep going, I go in. This is where it gets super sneaky. At the bottom, your coupon code, ART15, is reserved for 14 minutes and 50 seconds. You cheeky sods. So then I'm thinking, shit, so I've only got 14 minutes to find something that I really love, go to the checkout, put in my information, and I was thinking, hang on, I know this trick. I'm now in a state, so the dopamine is initiated, I got a reward, now they're putting me in a state of urgency and scarcity. It's like, no, hold on. So I'm taking screenshots, I'm like, okay, let's see if there's actually something here that I wanted. And one trick for this is saying, okay, if this was double the price, how would I feel about buying this? There's a little cheeky, hacks that you can do. So I got to the end of the 10 minutes, actually. It was 10 minutes in, and I thought, no, I've done a thorough appraisal of what's on offer here. I don't need anything at this time. They'll probably do this again at a different point. So then I click away, and within 10 minutes, I get an email to my inbox saying, we noticed you didn't make the most of your discount. Here's an extra 12 hours for you to use this code. They know what they're doing. And actually, I don't mind this kind of thing when you're creating dopamine loops or the potential for play in a way that is consensual, and that is such an important word here. They're inviting me to play. I can easily click away. I don't because I've landed on the site. It's fun. It's going to be for mutual benefit. If I want to buy something, I will. They are tweaking it so it's more playful, but I can always click away. So when it's done in a way that is consensual and that invites participation, that's going to be a good use for this sort of thing. But it doesn't have to be this extreme to get people involved. If you're creating an interface and you want to kind of work with this, but this is a bit too obvious and gamey, you can do it in a much more subtle way. So I use a lot of Adobe products in the design of my work, books and other things in design work. And what I loved was recently I received this email, and they said, free UI kit. Now, I don't really design that much in the way of user interfaces. Obviously, you do, so I took a screenshot. But what's nice is that they're giving me free things every now and again that might help me and benefit my goals. And so when I scroll down and see what's on offer, it's relevant, it's unexpected, potentially it's quite valuable. So this unexpected reward feeds into what we're talking about, the dopamine response. Another example of how to use this, a friend of mine works with a 3D rendering suite Marmoset toolbag, and what they do is invite their community to submit pieces of work that they've done using their tools, and then they will showcase the ones that are selected and reflect that back to the community. Now, people don't know if they're going to win or not, but because it's inviting participation, and then there's the reward of being featured, it again uses the dopamine system to say, okay, well, we're going to create something that's going to be valuable for you, it's going to be unpredictable, but it also feeds into our sense of community, which is a deeper way of getting people involved. Okay, so that's a lot of content. Hopefully you're all still with me. Essentially, to wrap this to a specific point, what I'd like to really drive home is that whatever your goal is as designers or in creating content or interfaces, you have to understand the principles, the biases, and the motivations that drive your customers, what it is they're trying to achieve, what it is that's going to make that easier for them. So I've condensed it a little bit. Here is a cheat sheet for you. Remember to reduce the interaction cost of things like reading, scrolling, attention switches, etc., to make sure that your interface is more fluent for people. Lower the cognitive load and the mental effort to encourage use. Remember, that's things like perceptual fluency, phonological fluency, making language easy to understand, splitting complex processes into single steps. Increase the processing fluency of your content where possible, make it easy to digest. Interrupt our hedonic adaptation. Remember, that's Angry Birds, making sure that people don't completely desensitized and become bored of your interface. And then deliver valuable and unpredictable rewards if and where appropriate to your customers. The thing is that all of this, applying behavioral science principles to optimize for an engaging, persuasive experience, all of this is well and good. But when we're designing to persuade, we also have to ask ourselves a much more fundamental question. It's not enough just to say, okay, could we use this principle in this interface? Is it possible to optimize the user experience in order to meet our goals as a company? We can't just ask that. We also have to be asking ourselves, should we be applying these principles in a specific way? Is it ethical? And I know that each of us have a very different idea of what we feel comfortable with versus others. So there is a gray area. But I would suggest that if you're designing something that feels coercive, that is not likely to reach a mutual benefit for you and the customer, then step away, because only in the long run it won't help build the reputation of your brand, which is what we're hoping to do. So as people designing these interfaces, you're actually both the architects and the users of our future web. The things that you go out and build that touch us in our everyday lives will set the expectations and the standards of best practice for years to come. So before we open for a Q&A, I'd like to leave you with this question. What kind of world do you want to build? Thank you very much for your time and attention. So, questions. We've got 9 minutes and 30 seconds, so get your urgency on.
Axel? So, a few years ago, they were asking if internet was making us dumb. And now, with the simple user interfaces, everything is easier. But when it comes to doing something a little bit more complex than scrolling a timeline, people are stuck. Even, like, I had a recent example with my sister. She was unable to do something with OneNote, for example, which is simple to me, but was not so for her.
Yes.
Now, that question of, is internet making us dumb, how valid would that question be if it's asked in the context of simple user interfaces?
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, I think the question when it was asked then has a different context than when we're asking it now. So if you're talking about 10 years ago, when a lot of the social platforms were in their infancy, we weren't contesting with such a huge amount of information coming at us. We were potentially a little bit more attention and time rich. Then it was more of a question of where is this technology leading us? If we get things to a point where they're super easy to use and they're convenient, does that change the way in which we involve ourselves in our environments? And the one answer is to say yes. If you look at technological advances, we expect ease, simplicity, or at least if we're dealing with complex systems, we want the entry point to be easy. And I think that's a crucial thing to raise here, is that we crave to be robustly engaged in the world that we're living with. And so when we're getting these simple, convenient fixes, a deeper part of ourselves goes unmet. And so it's a question of how do we create platforms that on the one hand give us a sense of convenience and ease, and maybe for social media it doesn't have to be complex, but what are the areas in which we're craving a deeper, more rich experience, and how can we design that so the entry point is easier, but then we can dive in? And I think if you look at wider trends, so for instance, thinking about, people always say, oh, we're getting dumber, our attention is lower, people aren't listening or thinking or reading as deeply as before. Think about the podcasts. People are devouring 3-hour-long podcasts. We're listening to long-form programs, we're reading long-form books, we're watching long-form content. Like, there is a thirst and a hunger for this. We're wanting to be met. So I think while there is the trend for that, and we have to make sure that it's no harder than it has to be, there's also an interesting question about what needs to be simple and where can we allow ourselves to create more complex environments and lead people through so that they can navigate those as best as possible. Yeah. Thanks for your question. Any more questions? Yes, there's one at the back. Someone wants to sprint down to the back. Chap on the right beside the exit door. Is there anyone else that's waving at me? No, not yet. Okay.
Thank you. It was pretty funny to see how, it was pretty funny to see how you used Angry Birds as an example of this dopamine loop thing.
Yeah. That one was hedonic adaptation, but it.
Oh yes,
kind of ties in.
I'm sorry,
That's
but
okay.
it was pretty much one of the first apps that used in-game purchases.
Yeah.
And it's like a really big problem in like mobile games right now, and in like high-level games on other platforms. So the question is, how would you suggest to fight marketing suggestions or like decisions to increase the percentage of these like techniques, psychological techniques, to engage people into these rather dark paths, to spend more and more money when they are like dopamine high and stuff?
Well, you're a black hat practitioner, aren't you? Okay, the first thing I'm going to say is it's a valid question because most of us are employed by companies who rely on profit, and so of course are going to be encouraged to make decisions that bring in profit at whatever level of cost is deemed appropriate by the company. So I appreciate the question. There's several things I want to say. The first thing is that the user experience isn't just about the in-app experience being fun for a while. It's also, well, unless you're designing your business to be a short-lived business, and maybe that's it, in which case, fine, blow out, use these principles. I mean, I don't endorse it, I don't think it's ethical, and that's not what I'm here to suggest that one does, because I don't believe in it. What I would say is if you are a company and you're wanting to use these principles to maximize your profits over time, which is crucially, I would think, what we'd want to do to become more robust as businesses, then it's going to be completely pointless. It's going to undermine the business to go for short-term profits. It just doesn't make any sense, especially if you're going to put it just from like a devil's advocate perspective, especially if you realize that people are now clearly aware of these practices, in some instances, that they'll feel duped, and that's not a good thing to feel if you're a customer working with a brand, and that pleasure also comes not only from the micro rewards, but also from a longer-term sense of partnership with the brand, of anticipation, and so there has to be a balance. Otherwise, it's like pushing the foot to the floor in a car and getting somewhere really fast, but then you're completely out of fuel. If that's your goal, great, but I wouldn't advise it. And I think also it ties into a wider, I don't know if I dare to go this way, but into a wider cultural bias that we have, this idea of linear, constantly forward, constantly progressing, constant increase in profits. That way of thinking is really not working for us. And so I think we need to step away from that. Sorry to be a bit more of a kind of, I don't know, I'm thrusting and parrying back at you there, but that's my thought and feeling on the subject. Anyone want to challenge me on that, or we've got someone else with their hands up?
We observe more and more voice as a way to interact. How do you see this trend? Is it a game changer in designing great user interface?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. So one of the things that we didn't touch on much today was voice interfaces. There's a couple of ways in which voice interfaces are absolutely fundamentally changing what's possible with tech. So especially when we think about people who are not as able to use their sight or their physical body to interact, this opens it up to people in a way that technology has previously been more limited. There's a really interesting question about what happens when we interact with audio systems as opposed to visual, physical systems. So when you're interacting with a screen, it's a separate object to you. You know that you're physically touching something to get a response. When you're responding to something which is audio-based, there's a potential to enter into parasocial relationship with something that is deemed to have a personality, like Siri or Alexa. They tell jokes. There's a sense of connection that we otherwise don't have when we're physically interacting with something. And so I think that one of the interesting things, from my perspective at least, of the ways in which audio interfaces are going to shape culture is what kind of social mores do we want to build in to these interfaces, do we want them to be polite, to reinforce polite behavior in their users? We're then starting to talk about a whole different kind of social and psychological set of ethics when designing for audio interfaces versus for visual. The other thing I'd say about this is that if you're designing interfaces, for instance, for cars, you don't want to be optimizing for the visual system. I know Tesla has a lovely, great big screen, but your eyes should be on the road, at least until vehicles are automated. Otherwise, you're running interference, the visual system will be looking at the screen instead of the road, and you end up with accidents that don't need to be happening. So there's also the great potential for audio interfaces coming into that space as well, where we need to optimize for other than visual senses. So that is really exciting. We've got 1 minute and 20 seconds left, so if you're burning to ask a question, and I will be here for the break, so if you're shy, I think there's a person over here. Can you raise your hand again for me?
Raise the hand, please.
You've got the mic? You don't have the mic yet. So I am here in the break, so if you're shy and you want to ask me a question, please come up.
Hey, I found the two examples that you gave quite interesting because they sort of represent two extremes of the spectrum in terms of, let's say, perhaps weird interactions with a potential customer.
Weird interactions?
Yeah.
I can't wait for this one.
On one hand, you've got the spinning wheel, which I found to be quite a premeditated example of such a thing. And on the other, you've got the more innocent looking and sounding sort of, give us your suggestions and give us your content and we'll put the top 3 or something like that, which is more akin to what you would find even, for example, in the kindergarten, you know, the best ones get rewarded.
Yeah.
So my question, in fact, comes in under the form of two questions. How pervasive do you think this is in terms of the premeditation that people put into these sorts of innocent-sounding contests, like, for example, the one about the arts? And the second one is, what do you think about recently some poetical figures defending that, for example, social media and things like that should start being regulated by the government?
Brilliant question, big question. We need to have a little discussion group around that. A round table would be really useful. To the first question, it's the same with the gamification of everything. You know, the website, now it's novel with the little spinny wheel. I've seen, it's the first time I encountered it on a website. It was fun, it was exciting. It's very clear what they're trying to do. It's only going to work a certain number of times before I just get annoyed by it. Kind of like with pop-ups. It'll increase conversion rates for a while, and then people are just going to click away. So there is this element of habituating to things and then discarding them. So that's just a question of time and how many people use it and how quickly it spreads and people don't want it anymore. With the social media thing, I'm going to be brief because we're running out of time here. There's a difference between, there used to be some sort of difference, I mean, they've never been quite completely clear, between user-generated content on social platforms used in the public domain, so a commons for discussion, versus propaganda and publications that were designed from a single source and then broadcasted out. That no longer has a distinction in terms of different arenas. Everything is merged. And so I think when it comes to, I would suggest that when it comes to social platforms, which now also have some semblance to publishing houses or publication platforms, I would suggest doing it by category. If there's anything that's related to more of a political stance, then it needs to have a different, there needs to be a different standard of appraisal of what will be allowed out, making sure it's clearly labeled as well. And then is there a third sort of independent body vetting the factual truth of the claims being made? But that's, I mean, that's a whole restructuring. We're not anywhere near that yet. So, yeah, tip of the iceberg. Thanks for your time and attention. Go have a cheeky coffee and see you a bit later. Thank you.